Chapter 17, Tear Gas. Ned introduced Nancy and himself. Their teenage pilot said his name was Bud Musgrove. As his small motorboat sped along, they looked into every cove and indentation of the river, going up one side, then starting down the other. So far, there had been no sign of the Billingtons' craft. "I'm sorry," Bud said. "You say you have the key to the motor, Ned. Then the person who took your boat might have known about it and has a duplicate. Have you any idea who he is?" Instantly, Nancy thought of Anton, but said nothing. Was he accustomed to borrowing the craft whenever he pleased? She asked herself, but why should he have gone to the Webster home? As Nancy was trying to puzzle this out, Ned suddenly exclaimed, "I think I see our boat! Over there at that rickety old dock." Bud headed for the spot. A house on the property had burned down. The area was secluded. It's a good place for someone to hide a stolen boat, Nancy thought. And for a thief to hide, too. Aloud she said, "Cut the motor! Quick!" Bud obeyed. In the sudden silence, Nancy spoke softly. "The thief may be hiding there, too. Let's go quietly and take him by surprise." The momentum of the craft carried it along quietly as Bud steered toward the dock. He pulled alongside the stolen boat. "No one's in it," Ned announced. He looked around. "I guess this has been abandoned." He pulled the key from his pocket and jumped in. Nancy was about to follow, but Bud held her back. "Better wait and see if the starbeam starts." Ned turned on the motor, but there was not a sound. He tried again and again without result. "That thief probably tampered with the boat and now it won't run," Nancy remarked. "Is the motor warm?" "No," Ned replied. "So the starbeam must have been towed here." Bud jumped into the craft, and together he and Ned examined the engine while Nancy beamed a searchlight on it. Finally, Bud said, "Several parts are missing. You won't be able to run this boat until they're replaced. I tell you what, let's tie it to the back of my motorboat and I'll tow you home." "Great! Thanks," Ned replied. When they arrived at the Billingtons' dock, Nancy invited Bud to come in. The young man smiled. "Sorry, but I'm supposed to be on my way to a party. My date will think I phased her out." The group at the house was amazed when they heard Ned and Nancy's story. Mr. Billington called the police to report that the boat had been found. He said to the others, "I'm certainly burdening the authorities lately. We make at least one call a day to the police." Everyone smiled, and Nancy thought, "We've come up with a few clues for them, too." Bess told Ned that his mother had phoned and was preparing a midnight snack for the young people. She was hoping the girls would move over there at once to start the house party officially. "I'm all for that," Bess added. "Tonight's adventures have given me a tremendous appetite." George teased her cousin. "You'd have had an appetite without any adventures." The three girls hurried upstairs and packed the clothes they would need for the next few days. When they were ready to leave, Nancy promised her father she would keep in touch with him and the Billingtons to exchange news about the case. Mr. Drew said he would contact Mr. Webster and tell him of the vandalism. "I'll ask him if he wants to have someone in town take care of it, or if he'd like me to." As he kissed his daughter goodnight, Mr. Drew wished her luck in getting results on Monday to her personal advertisement. "Maybe you'll find out who the members of the gang are. Anyway, my dear, watch your step." Nancy and Ned rode in the rented car, while the others took the Nickersons. Despite the fact that the official opening of the house party lasted until almost 2 o'clock, none of the young people slept late the next morning. After they had attended church services, Dave suggested that the whole group take a tour of the Space Center that afternoon. The others agreed. Nancy was just as intrigued by her second visit to the base as she had been before. The boys were especially fascinated by the rocket soon to lift off for the moon. George, who had been silent for several minutes, said, "I'd like to be an astronaut. What do you think my chances are?" "Oh, no!" Bess exclaimed. "Suppose you went to the moon and got stranded there." Smiling, Nancy remarked that she too would like to become an astronaut. Ned grinned and said, "How about letting us boys go first? We'll tell you how it is." The bus driver, who had overheard the conversation, seemed to be amused. He turned slightly and said, "You boys had better get started on your training. While you're here, why not go for a physical checkup and briefing?" "Great," Bert replied with a wink. George leaned forward in her seat. "What about me? Could I get the same treatment?" "I think so," the driver answered, grinning broadly. The others looked at Nancy. "How about you?" Ned asked. "Perhaps," she replied, knowing they were kidding her. "After this case is over." In a short time, the bus reached the vehicle assembly building. The tourists went inside. They were told about the immense structure and what took place there. Then the guide said, "The space vehicle that will lift off for the moon Tuesday was transported from here to its launch pad several weeks ago." Nancy and her friends were the first to leave the building. They wanted to get a better view of the huge spaceship. As they were coming out the door, two men, heavily bearded, came up to them. "Pardon me," said one. "We're doing an article on the moon flight for a science magazine. Would you mind if we take your picture and quote what we overheard you say on the bus about wanting to be astronauts?" The 6 young people looked at one another but did not answer. "Over here," said the second man, who had a large camera. "We won't use your names." He led the way around the corner to the side of the building away from the tourists. "I guess there's no harm in it," Ned whispered to Nancy. She nodded and followed the 2 men down the far side of the building. While one arranged the group against the wall with the girls in front, the other man focused his camera. "All ready," he said. His companion dashed out of the way, and the photographer clicked his camera. Instantly, a stream of tear gas shot toward them. Nancy and her friends tried to run, but their eyes began to smart and they could not see. In the distance, the guide was calling out, "All aboard!" Nancy heard running footsteps and assumed their attackers had fled. As the fog of tear gas dissipated, Nancy was able to see dimly, but not well enough to move very fast for fear of bumping into something. She realized, however, that a man was coming toward her. He proved to be one of the guards from the vehicle assembly building. Rushing up, he asked, "What happened?" Nancy choked out the answer. "Tear gas. 2 men with beards. One man had a camera that shot the stuff at us." "Follow me," the guard said. "We'll give you something to soothe your eyes." "My friends, too," Nancy told him. She could vaguely make out the rest of her group. Nancy called to them to follow her. By the time they reached the front door of the vehicle assembly building, the bus had gone. Nancy said there was a chance the attackers were on it. "Hadn't you better phone the visitor center and have the bus checked?" she asked the guard. "I'll do that at once. That is, as soon as I find someone to take care of your eyes." Suddenly, Nancy remembered the young engineer who was a relative of Hannah Gruen's. She asked, "Is Herb Baylor around? I know him." "I'll get him," the man promised, and hurried off. When Herb Baylor saw Nancy and the rest of the group and heard what had happened, he instantly took them to the infirmary, where a young doctor gave them first aid. He put a few drops of a soothing solution in their eyes, which soon relieved the burning sensation. There was a knock on the door, and the same guard walked in. He was holding 2 wigs with beards attached and a box camera. "I found these at the side of the building," he said. Nancy gasped. The men who used the tear gas must have been wearing them. Ned added, "Now we can't describe those villains and they'll get away easily." "Too bad," Herb remarked. "What was their motive?" George answered, "To scare us into dropping our detective work. But they can't do it." End of chapter 17.